go. We have a diverse session here, which I'll be moderating. Broadly speaking, it concerns some of the errors that can creep into pulse oximeter performance. I'm going to describe particularly how perfusion is a problem. Mike Bernstein, an electrical engineer, will review some of the components of circuit design that contribute to these issues. Ellis Monk's a sociologist from Harvard, who will be telling us about how skin pigment can influence pulse oximetry. And then finally, Mark Anselmino is a global health expert who's going to provide some very broad perspective on this issue. So the topic of my presentation this morning is the issue of the various components that create pulse oximeter bias. I'm going to be talking about what creates bias, about why pulse oximeters can be biased, and I'm going to give you some examples of bias that we understand fairly well. And then I'm going to describe how skin pigment is a bias that we do not understand fully, and how very likely it is quite a complex problem. John Severinghaus developed the modern methods for evaluating the performance of pulse oximeters. And when I joined his lab in the 1980s, one of his comments was that, oh, pulse oximeters will be perfected in a few years, and we won't have to use these laboratory methods to assess how pulse oximeters work. Now, John was a brilliant man. He invented blood gas analysis and was responsible for so many innovations in anesthesiology and critical care. But on that point, he was wrong. We're still trying to determine how pulse oximeters can be inaccurate. And I'm fond of this slide because it highlights a crucial point about this technology. A pulse oximeter is not a thermometer. It doesn't yield a single value which is absolutely believable. Think about what a thermometer does. You can measure the temperature of the air, of alcohol, of water, of any liquid. It will work at high altitude, at sea level, or the bottom of the ocean. It's virtually unaffected by anything. We have, as clinicians, many times assumed that pulse oximeters are the same. That's a fundamental issue that we need to address. It kind of goes beyond regulation. There's no regulation that's going to address that concept of thing. It's a matter of education that we all have some responsibility to advance. When we talk about pulse oximeter bias, there are some components of bias that make pulse oximeters read too high. They're fairly well understood, and included in them are carboxyhemoglobin. And I now think we can say that skin pigmentation biases pulse oximeters too high, although we don't understand the full reason why that happens. Furthermore, this is an issue with any degree of melanin. It's not just very dark skin compared to very light skin. In contrast, some of the things that make pulse oximeters read too low and that we know about are interfering substances in the blood. For example, methemoglobin, bilirubin sometimes, and various dyes like methylene blue and indocyanine green. And also increased venous pulsations can confuse the pulse oximeter and make it read too low. There's other confounding factors like anemia and low perfusion and motion. They can decrease the accuracy and precision, but it's not really correct to say that they produce a bias. Maybe for an individual instrument, they can produce a bias, but making an overall conclusion that low perfusion always makes the pulse oximeter read too high is factually incorrect. As we know. Takuya Oyagi's innovation of using light signals to derive an index of blood saturation was truly innovative. And what he realized was that red and infrared light, when shined through a finger and detected by a photodetector of some sort, was pulsatile. And it was pulsatile in a manner that varied with the oxygen saturation of the blood. And he created a dimensionless approach to the analysis of these signals by expressing these signals as a ratio between the AC component, the pulsable component, and the DC component. For red and infrared light, one could derive an index that is related to the saturation. Now, this number is dimensionless. It has to be calibrated. So you need to relate the signal to a saturation in a human subject. And that's the basis for the laboratory testing and validation of pulse oximeters. Now, it's one very important thing about this ratio. It decreases as the saturation increases. So any effect that decreases this ratio will tend to make the pulse oximeter read higher, and the opposite will tend to make it read lower. And in reality, these are the essential parts of how pulse oximeters work. And the rest of what pulse oximeters do is signal processing and dealing with noise in electronic circuits. Well, pulse oximeters see pulsable blood. Now, what's in pulsable blood? Pulsable blood contains oxyhemoglobin, deoxyhemoglobin, and dysfunctional hemoglobins. The way the pulse oximeter is set up, it's designed just to see the functional saturation. That is the fraction of oxyhemoglobin to the total of oxyhemoglobin plus deoxyhemoglobin. It ignores these other interfering factors in the pulsable signal in blood. By interfering substances, I mean things as depicted in this graph. It gets pretty complicated. At the top is something that's non-pulsable, melanin. And all the components of blood on the bottom are part of the pulsable components. So they include methemoglobin, oxyhemoglobin, and so on. So the distinguishing between pulsable and non-pulsable interferences, I think, is very important. Let's take the case of carboxyhemoglobin. So that's an interference that's in the pulsable blood, and it produces a positive bias in pulse oximetry. These are some data from my colleague John Feiner here, who gave subjects carbon monoxide to breathe and increased their carbon monoxide levels between 10 and 15%. And if these subjects are simultaneously desaturated, the pulse oximeter then reads too high. In other words, the pulse oximeter is seeing blood that looks redder or more saturated than it really is. So that confounds the measurements done at low saturation when the true saturation is actually lower. The opposite can occur for methemoglobin. So here, methemoglobin was increased between 4 and 15%. And on the bottom is a bias plot showing the hemoximeter saturation versus the difference between the pulse oximeter reading and the hemoximeter. And at higher saturation, when there's a significant amount of methemoglobin present, it makes the pulse oximeter read too low. So this is all fairly simple. We can kind of understand this. It gets a little more complicated with anemia because we start getting into issues of signal quality. Anemia, by reducing the amount of hemoglobin in the pulsable signal, creates a signal to noise problem for pulse oximeters. On different pulse oximeters, analyze low noise conditions in different ways, and they have different algorithms that are probably unique to all the major different types of pulse oximeters out there. So to investigate some of these issues, my colleague Ray Gillis and John Feiner and Jonas Apology and Ted Deliandis created this in vitro circulation device. So we can essentially reduce the hemoglobin to very, very low levels that would be unsafe to do in intact humans. And to make a long story short, the errors produced by low hemoglobin in this kind of a setup show substantial variation between different devices. It's impossible to say that anemia creates a positive bias all the time, or anemia creates a negative bias all the time. It's highly dependent on the device. So it's very difficult to make any overarching conclusions about low signal situations. Okay, now I want to turn to what's actually more relevant for today's and tomorrow's discussion. And what I'm going to describe next really was driven by Michael Schoeding's paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. When we saw his paper, we knew what was going on. At least we thought. And it was sort of one of those aha moments. bias because we had seen the problem that he described in the hypoxia lab over the course of doing desaturation studies for more than 30 years. So we decided to use data from our laboratory during controlled desaturation studies to see what factors contributed to pulse oximeter bias. So we wanted to understand why the pulse oximeter reading was different from the true value as assessed in a bench oximeter. And the studies overall involved controlled desaturation levels between room air levels and all the way down to about 70%. Now, an important part of the background of this study was the work that we published in 2005, in which our group was really the first to look in detail at the issue of skin pigmentation in pulse oximeter errors. It had been published previously, but no one had really done a detailed laboratory analysis where you really could control a lot of the variables that could produce errors. And we found that there was a positive bias in the reading of a number of different pulse oximeters, but that an additional very important factor was the degree of oxygenation. The difference between the pulse oximeter reading and the true value in arterial blood broadened at lower saturation. So it wasn't just something that was a constant bias across different saturation levels. So that was a very important additional factor which we wanted to consider. And in the lab at the time, we were simply using the Fitzpatrick scale for want of anything better. And really based on ignorance. We didn't realize that perhaps Fitzpatrick was not the best assessment. And I look forward to learning more about what we know about these issues and incorporating them into the future studies that we do. So the analysis we embarked on involved almost 10,000 pairs between pulse oximeter readings and corresponding blood gas values. And we subjected them to a multivariable model with outcomes that we knew probably had significant effects on or were significantly related to bias. These plots include all the data. So in the study, we had 25 very lightly pigmented subjects. We had 78 medium and 43 very darkly skinned people. Some of the subjects came back for multiple tests. So we were able to subject this to a repeated measures analysis. And the multivariable analysis that we did was really spearheaded by John Feiner, who's as you know, is a fantastic statistician. From a bird's eye view, the data that we found would be sufficient to say that the FDA would clear these devices. The RMSD errors for both the Nellcor and the Masimo that we studied were less than 3%. All looks pretty good. Look at just the scattergrams on the top of the plots and then the Bland-Altman analysis on the bottom. All looks pretty good. It would pass FDA clearance. No one would raise any questions about this. However, we dove deeper. Now, the human brain has a really hard time with multivariable analysis. And when John and I worked on the plots, we struggled a lot with how to represent them. And one of the clearer depictions we came up with is shown in this plot, where we segregated data by the type of pulse oximeter and by the skin pigment classification. So very light, medium, and dark. And we plotted the bias in the measurements. That is the difference between what the pulse oximeter was reading and what the blood gas analysis showed versus the subject's perfusion index. Just for a moment, look at the upper right panel versus the upper left panel. There's a very different distribution of bias as a function of perfusion index, with more darkly pigmented subjects having greater errors at low perfusion. The next graph is definitely hard to follow. And what it tries to depict are the effects of low perfusion and hypoxia on pulse oximeter bias from the two instruments that we studied. We studied a Massimo instrument that we removed from clinical care around 2017, so it was a Radical 7. And then we had a Nelcor N595 that was a reference instrument in our lab for a long time. So what we're seeing here is that bias on the vertical axes in each of the panels varies pretty substantially with the range of hypoxia and also with the level of perfusion. The red being perfusion greater than 2, the cyan between 1 and 2, and the black or dark blue is a perfusion index of less than 1. And we selected those levels based on a sensitivity analysis where we looked at different levels of perfusion to see what their contributions were to the bias. So you might ask, okay, well, what does this all mean? Well, we did a plot similar to what Schoeding showed us earlier this morning. And the red boxes contain data that would represent a missed diagnosis of hypoxemia. And as clinicians, we at UCSF broadly agree with what Michael Schoeding said about the clinical relevance of this range, because if one has a pulse oximeter that is reading in the 92 to 96% range, and the patient's blood oxygen is 88% or less, then that's a significant clinical problem. And so the boxes show the percentage of values that fall into that categorization. And we found missed rates of hypoxemia in our data sample between 8 and 30% in subjects who had a coincidence of darkly pigmented skin and low perfusion. So here's our data showing side to side. It's pretty good. So, or looks pretty similar, I should say. So this generated the hypothesis that low perfusion is the factor which is amplifying the bias of pulse oximeters in real-world clinical environments. And this observation was one of the driving forces behind the Equiox study that Carolyn Hendrickson so eloquently described this morning. All right, so I just want to show an example of this problem that we see in the laboratory. Here's a healthy young man in the upper left. He's ready to undergo a hypoxia study. And he has the latest Nelcor and the latest Massimo pulse oximeters attached. And so his perfusion index, I'm sure I can read it from this, I believe it was around 1. So it wasn't terribly low, definitely not high. You know, in San Francisco, we do warm our subjects' hands, but sometimes we are successful in getting their hands warm, and other times probably not as much. But when the pulse oximeter was reading 90 and 96, his blood oxygen saturation was 85. And when the blood oxygen level was 74, it's also depicted on the computer screen on the lower left, the pulse oximeters were reading 78 and 83. So we see this not infrequently under these conditions. A couple weekends ago, I was on call in the OR, and I was asked to take over the care of a pretty sick young patient. He was 36, he had fungal meningitis and sepsis. He had severe lung injury, and he was undergoing one lung ventilation during thoracoscopic surgery to try to drain some fluid collections in his thorax. When I took over the case, I immediately noticed a red flag. He had a pulse oximeter on his ear. And the corresponding reading on the monitor was 95% saturation. So I took a blood gas and sent it to the lab. His saturation was 89%. And the rest of the oximetry is there on the screen. When I took him back to the ICU, I asked the nurses why they put a pulse oximeter on his ear. And they said, oh, when we put one on his fingers, it was reading in the low 80s. We put one on his ear and it was reading in the 90s. So that's where we put the oximeter. At UCSF, this is not a rural hospital. This is the kind of things that we need to work on. All right. So what am I concluding here? What can we take home? Well, what I tried to convince you of is that accounting for skin color alone may not solve the problem that we're convened to solve, because there's a lot more to it, including low perfusion and critically the range of hypoxemia. And at this point, we are still fond of the hypothesis that low perfusion is likely a critical issue which amplifies pulse oximeter bias. And furthermore, different devices, because they handle low signals in different ways, they produce different amounts of bias under different conditions. And I think that's an important point for the consideration of using reference devices in validation studies, because under challenging conditions, the performance of even a validated reference device might vary. And I think that's something that the committee will need to consider. Couldn't have done this without fantastic Open Oximetry team. It really extends beyond UCSF. It's now a global entity, thanks to Mike Lipnick. I'm very proud to be part of that, and I've been thrilled to describe some of our ideas to you today. Thank you. Okay, next we have Ellis Monk. Oh, I'm sorry. Next up, oh, Mike Bernstein. How can I miss that? Mike Bernstein is one of the world's most experienced engineers in the field of pulse oximetry. He's been at the center of so many innovations in pulse oximetry design and innovation that it would be difficult to list them all. He's going to tell us a little bit, I think, about sort of the underlying electrical engineering issues in pulse oximeter performance.
There we go. Now I can share my screen.
And while Mike's pulling up his slides, there are a few questions in the chat that we're taking note of, so we will circle back to those. Please keep the questions coming. This session may generate quite a few of them that we'll be able to delve into this afternoon. So please keep the questions coming.
There's a question from Cameron McGuire about using perfusion index as a correction factor. And I think that could work if you also account for degree of hypoxemia. So it's more than just perfusion index. In our data, you see that in light skin, low perfusion does not produce this error. So you've got to include more than just the perfusion index in a correction factor. It's a complex interaction.
You talked about pulsatility though, right? And the perfusion index is a non-pulsatile signal because it's also drawn from the pulse oximeter, and it actually involves a DC component directly.
Okay.
How do you decouple that fact?
I think what we need to do is analyze raw signals, so we can really understand. I mean, we use a perfusion index from a pulse oximeter.
Exactly.
So that's a processed signal, and it's so we produced a correlation, and I think correlation is not necessarily understanding. It's a relationship, it's not a mechanism. But I take your point. Mike, are you ready?
Okay. Yeah.
For it?
Is my audio working now?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. As Phil is pointed out, The hardware design. Wait a minute, do I have the right presentation? No, I don't. So I don't have the right presentation.
Okay, where is that?
It's in that folder that's behind this.
Which one?
While that's being addressed, let me go to a few of the questions. There's one from Jim Stafford. He asks, is there a reason to believe that skin tone effect would be different between transmissive and reflective pulse oximeters? That's a great question. To my knowledge, that hasn't been studied. I think that's something that we could study.
There was a
And-
study
And it's an important
I think,
question.
from a researcher in South Korea that looked at transplant.
Okay.
Also, like regional oximetry also uses transmitters.
Another question from Josh Pfeffer at the FDA. He commented that actually your results showed a negative bias for white subjects at low saturation, did they not? I believe that's correct. There's a slight negative bias, but it's small. It's much smaller than the large positive bias in darkly pigmented subjects at low saturation.
I'm sorry, this is Josh. I'm sorry, I meant at low perfusion for the Massimo light skin graph shows a very similar negative bias, kind of the mirror image of the black skin result, it seems like. I'm looking at the.
Yes, you are correct. But the magnitude of that effect, as I said, is small.
It looks, I mean, the graphs indicate it's about the same. Is it not?
The precision difference too.
Yeah, Dr. Feiner can maybe.
Yeah, well, I think the other notable thing to pay attention to is the increased noise with dark skinned subjects too. It's not just the bias that changes at low perfusion and low sat, but the variability in noise, which I think is bigger for dark skinned subjects.
I was curious, how many subjects actually showed that bias? What did it look like on the repeats? You guys analyze the repeats.
So I can tell you that the bias varied between the same subject on different days, depending on their perfusion index. So that was one of the powers of the study is we captured data from the same people under different conditions, and that was accounted for in the model that we used.
And so when the extremity is heated, you're also looking at erythema. I mean, that's just part of the scale when you're able to get these optical measurements. Are you seeing differences that potentially could affect that bias when that extremity is heated versus not?
We are currently collecting data on that point. We're now
You're busy.
we now have a study where we are actively warming and cooling
Okay.
subjects' hands differentially.
Hmm.
So we have same oximeter on different hands, one hand warm, one hand cold. But
Nice.
that will be helpful towards answering your question.
Can I ask
Mike's
how
all
you?
good to go.
Mike, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Please.
Okay, so I think one of my biggest concerns about the physicians that use the electronic stuff that we build for them is that they believe the numbers. And I just want to explain that comment a little bit, which is all electronic systems have a noise floor. They all have noise. And in most cases, it's purely random noise. And the noise is fixed, and anytime the system is working, it's there. We use a signal to noise ratio to describe how noise affects the signal, where it's just the signal, the noise divided by the signal divided by the noise is the signal to noise ratio. And so we look at plethysmogram, and so this is the wave that you often see displayed on a monitor. It's a pretty clean, nice looking wave, but it's usually been filtered for display. And the underlying wave can look like this. And I think the engineers in the room would agree. And the noise on the waveform can be interpreted by the Pulse Oximeter software as part of the plethysmogram, leading to incorrect values. And I'm going to show what happens when you have the simplest algorithms. And that describes most of the low-cost fingertip algorithms that are available. And they use a peak-to-peak that just looks at the minimum and the maximum of the wave to calculate SpO2. And fortunately for me, Phil explained that in his presentation. So all I have to do is explain what the noise does to it. So the red trace is the underlying plethysmogram, and the blue trace is what happens when you put electrical noise on it. That noise is coming from the pulse oximeter circuitry, and you can see that if the software is designed just to grab the highest high and the lowest low, which many are, you get a huge change in the what you would see as the peak-to-peak modulation, which then can cause an error in the ratio large enough, in this case, to cause a 5-point change in the saturation. So obviously, there are more sophisticated algorithms around there. But I'm just showing what you get here, which is that you get a kind of a random variation out of 200 some odd data points from 11 subjects, 3 of whom had dark skin. And you can see at the bottom that the device cuts off its low saturation at 70. So it causes kind of a thick line at the bottom. But I would say that the noise in this case was just causing a random scatter. And part of the reason from putting this in is Phil was showing, and other people have been showing, the results from pretty good pulse oximeters. And this is what happens when you use one that isn't so good. But what happens when you have system noise is that, and a signal to noise ratio, is that the signal to noise ratio gets smaller if you decrease, it gets worse if you decrease the size of the signal. And so on a dark-skinned subject, regardless of whatever else is going on, is going to have a worse signal to noise ratio because they have less light. So the whole signal gets smaller, so the signal to noise ratio gets worse, and it gets harder to separate out the real data from that noisy waveform that I just showed. The same thing happens with low perfusion. if the perfusion gets smaller, even if there's plenty of light, if the perfusion gets smaller, then the signal gets smaller and the signal to noise ratio gets worse. And if you combine low perfusion with low light levels, you get a really bad situation. So in some ways, certainly in terms of the basic signal that the pulse oximeter software gets to work on, as it comes out of that analog to digital converter, it's really, the impact is exactly the same if there's low perfusion or dark skin. If you make the perfusion half as good, and if you make the light getting through the measurement site half as much, it has exactly the same effect on what we have in our pulse oximeter designs, what we have to work. So in a very simple design, a very simple algorithm, like a cheap fingertip pulse oximeter, the random changes in the signal that come from the random electrical noise cause random errors in the pulse oximetry. And just the other thing is, just to give an idea, they need a signal to noise ratio of roughly 50-1 to work correctly in the cheapest cases. Because you need, if you, sorry, I don't want to get too technical. I tend to wander off. And at the other extreme of this world, advanced devices like Massimo and Melcor can work quite well at signal to noise ratios of 1-1, which is why, they're accepted clinical devices, and why they're used in hospitals, is they actually justify their high prices with better performance. But even the best devices will sometimes report incorrect numbers, even at the very low SNRs. The algorithm has to have this, to put it in human terms, has to be self-aware enough to know that it's reached its limit. And sometimes they don't always know. So different algorithms react very differently to low SAT. The Nelcor algorithm, for example, tends to, for reasons in its filtering, tends to end up displaying a SAT of 80% when it's completely lost for a while before it says, okay, I'm lost. The Massimo algorithm, because it uses a very, very smart thing called the SAT transform, and where one of the fundamental assumptions is that the venous SAT is lower than the arterial SAT, will sometimes, when there's a lot of noise there, pick up on noise at a high SAT and report that value because it thinks the other stuff that's going on is the venous SAT, which in some cases is the patient's real SAT when it's in the 70s. And the thing that it picks up as the arterial SAT is noise. This happens very infrequently. When they first introduced the technology, it happened a lot, but now it happens really infrequently. But what causes the problem? What causes the problem is when you combine dark skin and low perfusion, you cause pulse oximeters to struggle far more than they do in general. So what you see when you're using a Massimo is a cluster of very high SAT readings at very low SpO2 levels. And what that really is, in some cases, or I'll say maybe, because I'm a technologist and I don't think about the physiology, I don't understand the underlying other underlying effects, but I say, well, you could explain that that rather than a racial thing or a skin color thing, it's just data being colored by the algorithm in the instrument. And that if we could make the instrument lower noise, more sensitive, and better, which we always strive to do, but if we could do that, then that problem would go away for those patients. So anyway, I think I've gotten to the end. Basically, I looked at several. There was another group of data. There was Schoeting's data, which showed some high values, and there was another. Was it Dr. Hendrickson's that showed some high data for Masimo pulse oximeters? And I was thinking, well, maybe because you have this line and all the data is clustered around the line, and then you have these couple of points up at high SpO2 values, that those couple of points represent that pop-up. But anyway, I don't know, and I just wanted to mention that to everybody, that there's other explanations in physiology.
Great, thank you, Mike.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Mike. We're going to hold comments and questions till the end. Next up is Dr. Ellis Monk. Ellis is an associate professor of sociology at Harvard University. He learned his PhD in sociology from the University of California, Berkeley, and a BA in sociology from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He had previously taught at the University of Chicago, and as well as Princeton University. He is a 22 recipient of an NIH Director's New Innovation, which supports his research on race, skin tone, and pulse oximetry. Ellis?
All right, well, thank you so much for having me here. Sorry I couldn't be there in San Francisco with you. It would have been nice to visit the Bay Area again after all these years. But alas, I'm here in cold, snowy Boston, so oh well. So what I'll talk about today in this talk is really thinking through some of the potential health disparity confounders for pulse oximetry. We've heard a lot about the device itself and some of the issues around that. But in particular, one of the issues that I think we're all really concerned about here is what is the specific role that melanin or pigmentation may play in pulse oximetry accuracy. And in order to do that, in order to understand that, we're going to need to design studies that can deal with some of these potential confounders. So I think, as everyone here knows, lots of the studies that were done to test some of these devices didn't necessarily use the most diverse sample of patients and study participants. And that's one of the reasons why people believe that skin tone may play a role in lack of accuracy, particularly for those of darker skin. And if we look at some of the research that I think we're all pretty well acquainted with, like the Schoeting paper, what this paper is showing is really differences between racial categories, right? Between Black and white patients. Now, it's been known for quite some time, or at least reported, that there are lots of different things that could confound pulse oximetry accuracy. Some of the things that have been mentioned today, like anemia or cardiovascular issues, perfusion, and we know people who do stuff in epidemiology and health disparities like myself, but many of you in this room as well, that race is associated with precisely these issues. So when we think about some of the findings from the studies using the racial categories, one thing to think about are the dramatic health disparities that we see between Blacks and whites. For instance, this was reported back in 1990, rather infamously, that Black male youths in 1980 were less likely to survive to the age of 65 than male youths in Bangladesh. And there is a 5-year gap in life expectancy at age 25 between Blacks and whites. applying a social determinants of health framework to these issues to help understand these issues. And there's a lot going on my screen here, but we've already kind of been, this has been in the air already with some of the earlier presentations. Race can be implicated in these kind of disparities through many different pathways that have absolutely nothing to do with genetics or biology or anything like that, but rather things like economic stability, education, access to food, the healthcare system itself. And if we go further down this particular chart, you have various forms of social stress that research has shown definitely is correlated, associated very significantly with things like hypertension, diabetes, thrombosis, et cetera. So when we think about disentangling the effect of, say, race or skin tone on pulse oximetry, these are some of the issues that are associated with identifying with being ascribed to these different racial categories in our society that we might want to do very well to disentangle and to think very clearly about what are the real sources that are leading to these issues. Now, this becomes much more complicated because if we look at what our research is telling us about ethno-racial health disparities in the United States, it shows us that health disparities between Blacks and whites often remain even after we control for SES and health behaviors, and that health disparities within race are often as large or even larger than between race health disparities. So even as I point out that a lot of the potential confounders that people have spoken about today are associated with racial categories, it's still not clear in the current literature on health disparities how we explain all of those associations. And furthermore, there is a lot of suggestions in the literature that these disparities may actually even be larger within race. Which is to say that there may be perfusion differences within race associated with all sorts of other factors that are also important to take into account when you're designing a study. So the kind of hallmark of my research agenda has been looking beyond these ethno-racial categories, these official census-style categories. I often refer to this as looking beyond the binary of just looking and comparing Black and white or between any particular ethno-racial category, and to focus on skin tone disparities specifically, or skin tone stratification, and to have a better understanding of that. And I think one common thing that happens, and this is something that even, is Dr. Martin Luther King, right? Not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. What he's doing here is he's really doing something called metonymy. He's treating color, which is this characteristic that we use to kind of refer to how people are ascribed to different racial categories. And he's linguistically substituting that for this broad membership in a racial category. But the real key here is that even though we understand that race and color are not necessarily the same thing, in our language, on our census forms, and this isn't even just in the United States, but even Brazil, another country I study quite deeply as well, there's this typical tendency to conflate racial categories, like on a census, with actual skin color. And unfortunately, that kind of wipes out this long history of colorism and skin tone stratification in the United States, which, if we're thinking about the African-American experience in particular, actually goes all the way back to slavery, where there were lighter skinned and mixed race people who had kinship ties to whites. They were treated preferentially during slavery. They were more likely to be freed, more likely to know a skilled trade, much more likely to have education. And there's even evidence that some of the lighter skinned mixed race people even practice forms of social closure among themselves to protect these privileges. And one thing I like to point out, which is somewhat counterintuitive to, I think, the way people usually think about race in the United States, is that throughout US history, this country actually went longer without the one drop rule. This idea that what makes someone Black is one drop of Black blood and skin tone actually is not the defining feature, rather it's your ancestry. The United States actually went longer without the one drop rule than it's actually had the one drop rule, which was not officially institutionalized in the United States until the 1920s. Up until that point, different parts of the United States had multiple racial categories. In particular, Louisiana and South Carolina recognized these different racial categories. Sometimes people refer to this as like a tri-racial system with black, brown, and white, these kind of gradational categories. These were fully recognized well into the 20th century. So the kind of stepping point here is to say that on one hand, we have a lot of studies that use racial categories and then make claims about skin tone and pigmentation as potential issues with pulse oximetry. But what I'm trying to point out here, first of all, is that belonging or ascribing to a particular ethno-racial category on the census is not the same as skin tone itself, okay? And one issue here, one complication is that even the confounders that I'm kind of pointing out here, like cardiovascular issues, all these other healthcare access issues, even these things that are associated with race, they're also associated with skin tone within and across these officialized racial categories. So one of the key findings across a whole number of my studies, which I summarize in this paper in Data List, The Unceasing Significance of Colorism, is that there's actually as much socioeconomic inequality along the color continuum among African Americans, but potentially even among Hispanics, Latinx, as there is between Blacks and whites as a whole. And again, this is somewhat counterintuitive way of thinking about race and racial inequality in our country. Usually we see a lot of comparisons between racial categories, but the reality is that there's actually a significant amount of inequality that is associated with skin tone gradients within these racial categories. And of course, when we think about confounders, we're going to have to think about skin tone as well. So I'll walk you through some of these findings. And I just want to keep people, engaged in the social determinants of health framing, which is that I'm not saying that there's biological or genetic issues here with skin tone, and I'll have a little bit more to say about that later on. But everything on this chart is also potentially associated with skin tone. So first of all, if we look at education in the United States, if we were to compare Blacks to whites, we would see a gap of about 10.2 months in education. But looking within the Black population, using nationally representative data, I found that the educational gap within the Black population was 15.4 months between the lightest and the darkest skinned African Americans, which is to say that there's actually more inequality within the Black population associated with skin tone than there is between Blacks and whites as a whole. Similarly, I looked at a nationally representative data set to look at the criminal justice system. Here we find that there is a gap in the probability that someone has ever been arrested that's associated with race, and we see that gap between Blacks and whites. But if you look on the other side of this same chart, the gap in probability of having ever been arrested is similar to the Black-white race gap in arrest. And you can see there's a very clear gradient there, especially among Black men. And this is controlling for education, income, anything you can pretty much control for in this data set. Again, the idea here is that darker skin is associated with all forms of stereotypes and discrimination in our society, and they may be treated worse by police, and there's lots of evidence pointing in that direction. Similarly, I find these gaps in incarceration. Same story here. And if we think about the labor market, I have a study that I led with a couple of colleagues, Hetty Lee at Duke University and Michael Esposito at the University of Minnesota. And what we did here was we looked at race, skin tone, BMI, perceptions of attractiveness, and we modeled all of this to try to have a better sense of intersectionally speaking. When we take lookism, which is discrimination on the basis of physical appearance, in conjunction with colorism and racism, and all of these forms of discrimination into account together, what are the labor market effects of these different forms, these different systems of discrimination and bias in our society? And what we find here are huge earning gaps within and across all of the major racial categories in the United States. For instance, Black men who are darker skinned and are receiving these lower attractiveness scores, they're earning 61 cents on a dollar compared to those in the upper echelons, the upper 95th percentile of perceptions of attractiveness. And these perceptions, which are of course subjective, they're highly correlated with skin tone. And that's one of the major drivers that we talk about in our paper. All of which is to say, from the education system to the labor market to the criminal justice system, we see these strong correlations between skin tone and different forms of inequality that may also end up manifesting itself in mental and physical health disparities that are important to think about as potential confounders in pulse oximetry. So there's a lot of research on social stress, and this is one of these kind of iconic charts that's talking about the social stress process and how social stress may actually affect mental and physical health. In particular, people hypothesize, and some have even claimed to show, dysregulation of the HPA axis may be really key in thinking about how social stress like discrimination, mistreatment in society may actually manifest itself in poor mental and physical health. In some of my research, I conducted some of the first nationally representative studies to isolate different forms of discrimination and to see how these different forms of discrimination, both within a particular racial category, but also perceived between racial categories, were associated with skin tone among African Americans. And what I find is that not only is skin tone associated with different dimensions of perceived discrimination, from everyday discrimination to major lifetime discrimination, which is a measure of being kept out of neighborhoods or abused by police, it's also associated with colorism, which is perceptions of skin tone specific discrimination within and between different ethno-racial categories. And the one key thing I want to highlight here is that I find that perceptions of intra-racial colorism, skin tone discrimination within the Black population is also a driver of physical health disparities. And in particular, it's associated with cardiovascular and cardiometabolic disorders, including diabetes. All of which is to say that if we have a social determinants health frame and we think very deeply about the potential confounders, the health confounders for pulse oximetry, all of the et cetera, are associated not only with race, but also with skin tone. And there's even a study that looks at siblings of two different skin tones and even controls for genetics and still finds a link between skin tone and hypertension using nationally representative data. So to close, I just want to hit a few points. First of all, race in terms of the census category, self-identification, and skin tone as perceived from people, a socially perceived, visually perceived skin tone, are not the same characteristic. And I think there are a lot of really compelling reasons to believe that skin tone, melanin, pigmentation affects pulse oximetry. I think it definitely is a part of this overall puzzle, but it's also the case that there are potential confounders that have to do with mental and physical health in particular, that are also associated with skin tone. So to go back to Dr. Hendrickson's excellent presentation, we may be dealing with something that is overdetermined by multiple different pathways simultaneously, and that means to isolate the effects of skin tone on pulse oximetry. In particular, we're going to need rigorous and creative studies that directly measure skin tone, which I'll talk about a lot more tomorrow, but also considers these myriad potential confounders. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ellis. Next up, we have Dr. Mark Ansermino, who is a professor in the Department of Anesthesiology, Pharmacology, Executive Medical Director for Global Health at British Columbia's Children's Hospital in Vancouver, Canada. Welcome, Mark. Good to see you.
Hi. Thanks very much, Phil, and thank you for the invitation to talk to you today. It's a great pleasure. And I would firstly like to acknowledge that I'm not an engineer, I'm an anesthesiologist, but I've hung out with some fantastic engineers, including Mike, and learned a whole lot from them. But what I do these days mostly is global health work, and I was very concerned that a lot of studies, including pulse oximetry, but other measurement studies were being done in devices used in these settings where people didn't understand this concept of measurement uncertainty. And having been educated in this, I think a lot of clinicians don't understand this. And so I was eventually, coerced, encouraged to write a paper that was recently published on this. But I think this is very relevant to the conversation that we are having today. So first of all, credit to all of those people. First of all, a definition is what is measurement uncertainty. And I know this was used particularly by the engineers earlier in conversation. And I think that most clinical folks don't really have a good understanding of what uncertainty means. So, I went to ask GPT chat to help me with this and put it into lay language. Measurement uncertainty means that there might be a mistake when we measure something. This can happen because the tool we use to measure is not perfect, the environment is not ideal, or because people can make mistakes. When we talk about measurement uncertainty, we say that we are not 100% sure that our measurement is completely accurate. We give a range of values that tells us how much the measurement could be wrong. This helps us to understand how reliable our measurements are and how much we can trust them. A little bit edited by me, but I think that that's a pretty good summary. And when we talk about this, I think it's really important for us to understand this concept of what the truth is. And, we talk about gold standards and various other things, but obviously there's some true value that we're trying to estimate when we're using a device to measure physiologic parameter. And as we said in this paper, the true value of a measurement may be ephemeral, time varying, and unmeasurable. So we will never know really what that true value is. And all we can do is we can measure some value. And we can, know what the error is, or what we call bias today. But another very important part of this is the uncertainty range around what we're actually doing with that measurement. And that, is really important for us to understand and to be able to see the context of this within when we're comparing devices or when we're using devices clinically. So I'm just going to show you, a couple of the tables that we came up. We thought about this a long time. But when we start talking about this uncertainty, when we're looking at, designing a device, we kind of lump all of this. And certainly this was happening in these studies I was seeing, that we kind of lumped all the uncertainty and putting all of that blame on the sensor and said, like these devices were not performing well enough. But in actual fact, this uncertainty happens for many other reasons. And we've heard a lot about that today. The other speakers have really addressed this. It could be the subject, and obviously skin tone is one thing, but there's lots of other things. I deal a lot with newborns, and there's no doubt that age is a huge factor when you start looking at accuracy of pulse oximetry. And this has nothing to do with the device. This just has the fact that the oxygen saturation varies breath to breath as the child becomes relatively hypoxic between breaths. There's also this huge issue of observer uncertainty. And, we know that repeatability of pulse oximetry measurements is not perfect, but we need to account for this when we actually design our studies. So we really came up with some ideas with each of these measures, each of these causes of uncertainty, to try and look at how we could design studies and ask specific questions that we could try and address this. And the reason for doing that is then we can put all of these measures of uncertainty next to each other and look at the different impact that each measure has. And remember, each of these measurement uncertainties have different distributions. So some may be normally distributed. A lot of the stuff that we look at in pulse oximetry is not normally distributed. It has a skewed distribution, it's time varying, but it also varies depending on what the oxygen saturation level is. So we also have, the context where this might be. We have, how this is actually captured, what device is actually used, and how this is analyzed, like how it's averaged. And these, at the end of the day, there is going to be some uncertainty that's also unknown, that we'll never really know what this is. But I think that there's things we can do in the design, and we can maybe run nested studies in doing this to look at some of these uncertainty factors that we can use to understand where this uncertainty, where the differences between a reference and a test device is actually coming from. But there's another whole concept of this, and I know that Sandy did address this earlier, which is really the clinical uncertainty. And I think that we should not forget about this, because this is really important. And certainly in the context that I work, which is really around guidance, is put up by the WHO and everything like that, there's really this lack of understanding when using thresholds to provide guidance around the use of things like pulse oximetry, that there's a lot of uncertainty how we actually do this. And we need to really look at ways that we can improve this this understanding, first of all, of what this uncertainty is, but how we can actually improve how we choose these thresholds and how we communicate the use of these thresholds within the clinical context. And then, of course, it's this whole issue of us as humans and how we perform. And obviously, Daniel Kahneman has been published lots of really great stuff, and his latest book, Noise, is fantastic looking at this. But there's no doubt that how we as clinicians use this information is critically important. So my final message to you is that, you know, don't throw the device away. We know that there's a lot of uncertainty around this, but it's really important for us to measure each one of these uncertainties and understand the relative contribution in each context on what this uncertainty is. We can do very practical things to reduce this uncertainty. And as we said, we can improve our signal to noise ratio. As Mike said, we can make better devices, but also clinically, the things that we can do. For example, we can make sure that we, you know, have less, a higher perfusion index, or, you know, less interference in how we're actually measuring this. We can perhaps do duplicate measurements. There are other really practical things that we can actually do to try and reduce this, but we should also balance that with optimizing how we make clinical decisions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Ansarmino. That was great. Do we have time for a few questions?
Yeah, I think we could do about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll do a 45-minute lunch break after that.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks everybody for adding comments and questions to the meeting chat. I think the what I have falls along two broad groupings. The first is sort of encapsulated by a comment from Gorham Beeson about pulse oximeter errors. And Gorham asked, could the software know what is the signal and what is the noise, and therefore be realistic about its own accuracy, and even report its results as a confidence interval or a range of plausible true values that perhaps reflects the ambient conditions of measurement? Mike Goodstein, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah. Do I need to turn a microphone on or anything?
You can just speak, you're good.
Okay. You know, that's kind of the holy grail of measurement, is being able to tell the difference between signal and noise. And so it's really what we spend the most time doing in developing a pulse oximeter, is developing an algorithm that does the best job of digging the real life signal out of the noise. And just to give you an idea of what goes on, if you look at the wave that was going into a Masimo or an LCOR monitor when they're at the very low perfusion limit of a dark subject, all you would see was noise. And yet their algorithm is so good that they can both usually come up with the right number. So, you know, the answer is really, we're doing the best we can. We can't do it all the time.
To phrase it differently, I don't know if I'll maybe just phrasing it differently. I mean, I think Norm's question is, are some algorithms doing a lot of digging and processing to come up with that number, and can that be translated into something that communicates to the provider that, you know, hey, I'm working through a lot of noise, and you should be aware of that, because that means I may be a little less certain in what I'm reporting to you. Because it doesn't, what's reported to the clinician doesn't reflect what the device is doing to get that number.
Yeah.
It's reducing the pulse oximeter to the thermometer. It's giving a single value, and the user doesn't know whether that's a solid value or it's based on an estimation and a background of a large amount.
Well, you're absolutely right. In the early days, Nelcor had a blip meter on the thing on the front, which was a good quality indicator because it wasn't auto scale. It was an absolute, how big is the signal blip meter. But now Nelcor and Masimo both have auto scaled waveforms. So you can't tell if they're tiny or big. So you're absolutely right. We could give you something, and by and large, we don't.
Just
And
as a
tomorrow, there
clarification.
will be a topic, there will be an hour dedicated to how
Exactly.
communication could be improved. So
Yeah.
just to not get too into the weeds on that here, there will be a 1 hour session just to this specific topic in depth. Sorry, I think there may have been some
Yeah,
more
just
comments. down
as a clarification, although the butt was normalized, there is a signal key
Oh,
that will be absolute.
oh, I didn't know.
It will let you.
Oh.
Yes, sir.
Caroline?
Sorry,
Yeah, in addition to the way the machine is reporting information or uncertainty, I think, Phil, you brought up a really good point, which is our clinician colleagues, if they're getting two different values from two different sites, like they want to believe the higher one because we're often trained to think that the lower one is a bad reading and therefore less accurate. But I think there's really important messaging coming out of this discussion that, in fact, that is probably not the correct way to interpret that data. But nobody teaches us how to do that in nursing school or medical school or respiratory therapy school. And, we could message differently than the devices do also and offer some education interventions.
I think that's an absolutely essential thought.
Yeah, could I just comment that I think this idea of number preference is like a huge issue, and I think this is relevant to clinical decision making, but also to research. So, like, I think that these are some practical things we can do to obviously try and address this by education, but certainly in the research context, I think it's absolutely mandatory that all these studies have automated capture of pulse oximetry. And another issue that's very closely related to that is the resolution of that data. So ideally, we want the pulse oximetry data at least 1 decimal place resolution.
Thank you. Good point.
And Julian has his hand up.
Julian, you have your hand up? You have a
yes,
a
I do.
question?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, just I wanted to make 2 points, and I was going to be one, but now I'll add since what Mark said. I think that this would be good for us to make recommendations that instruments should emit their data, so they should transmit their data from the interface following available standards such as the IEEE 1173 standards to make it easier for data to be acquired and interpreted in these studies. And that there's some work that we've done in our lab and others have done, and we're happy to share that if it's helpful to move this along regarding the data interoperability from pulse oximeters. The point I wanted to make is the notion that the concept, the idea that a pulse oximeter could do a better job of letting us know when there are borderline conditions that could affect accuracy is obviously very desirable. And manufacturers have been pressed for some time, but they're pressed in 2 different directions. One direction they're pressed in is, why are you showing us data if this data might be suspect because it's at the limits of performance? And so if a manufacturer blanks the screen and doesn't show the data, then other people say, hey, I'll take any data that I could get because it potentially could guide me on better probe application. So I think we have to take those requests in context with the ways that we measure pulse oximetry performance and accuracy, because those edge cases might be, have lower accuracy. So then how does a manufacturer deal with that when reporting results? So it's an old discussion. It's one that should be revisited for all the reasons we talked about. And I concur that all of us have been essentially trained ourselves somewhat empirically, and that's what we see everyone do is keep moving the probe, get the highest value, and after all, the chart looks better when you have the highest set.
Thanks, Julian. Leah?
I just wanted to ask a question following up on something Mike talked about with signal to noise. And an analogy would be if you walk into a room that's dark, you look around, you say, I can't really tell where I'm going because the signal to noise of your eyes is low. Your eyes just are not built to work in the dark. And you turn the lights up, right? But you turn the lights up to fix it. And so my question is, are any of the algorithms in any of the existing devices, do they ever look at the raw DC signal from the red, for example, and say, this is low, this is close to my noise floor. I should turn up the power on the LED, make it bright. Do they do that?
Almost every pulse oximeter does.
Right. And so the issue that you're talking about of signal to noise, why is it not overcome by turning up the lights?
Because there isn't enough light.
So is it, but you can make brighter LEDs. Are
Yeah.
those LEDs nearing the edge of what's allowed by ISO
Yeah,
standards?
you have the third, I forget what it is, 41 degrees C skin temperature limit among other things. But the real solution is to improve the signal acquisition channel. The technology has moved ahead really, really fast to make better SpO2 devices ever since they became high volume. And you can get 20 to 40 dB better SNR now in the receive channel. But yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Mike. And Leo. Mike, do we have time for a few more questions? Okay, and the second line of questions involves healthcare disparities. I believe stimulated by the presentation of Dr. Monk and others, and Carolyn Hendrickson earlier this morning. Grant Aaron asked to Dr. Monk, how big of an issue is treatment bias in U.S. healthcare broadly, not just in issues related to pulse oximeters?
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of gave a brief answer in the chat, but my takeaway from all the research I've done and everything I've read is I believe it's probably a large factor. And in fact, I've actually begun to design some audit studies with a postdoc here at Harvard, where we'll be studying patient-clinician interactions, not just in terms of the racial category, but in terms of varying things like skin tone, perceptions of attractiveness, which are linked with skin tone and BMI, and to have a better, more robust understanding of how these interactions may be driven by biases above and beyond just these broad racial categories. So I certainly do think that's something that plays a large role in these issues.
I was particularly taken by your data showing that skin pigment is sort of a continuous variable in these disparities and in perception. That unitary treatment of race and skin color is no more relevant to that consideration than it is to what a pulse oximeter sees, where we find that essentially skin melanin is a continuous variable that predicts pulse oximeter. In your conceptions and analysis, skin color is a continuous variable that determines some social elements.
Correct. So yeah, to be perfectly clear, so skin tone is continuous. We know colors. We see millions of them as human beings, and then we bunch them into these little categories and whatnot. Hence these visual scales that I'll talk about a little bit more tomorrow. But absolutely, we see these skin tone gradients not just among African Americans, but other ethno-racial groups as well. And as my study suggests, these skin tone gradients, which are usually pretty linear effects, are associated with all forms of inequalities, from health to education, criminal justice system. And again, the linchpin here is the idea, as social psychologists like Jennifer Eberhardt at Stanford, who won a Genius Grant for showing some of this, really demonstrates very well, is that skin tone biases are linked to discrimination, stereotyping in such a way that people who are darker skinned, even within the same racial group, within the same category, may be seen as more dangerous, less, competent, et cetera. And that's definitely going to spill over into healthcare interactions and all kinds of other things that I think we should care about very deeply.
Great, thank you very much, Alice. Anyone in the group want to pose questions to any of the speakers from this session?
I would have a general question in regards to accuracy and uncertainty. What is the expectation from the clinicians how accurate a co-oximeter is?
So I absolutely right. And in that diagram I showed, it doesn't show that even our gold standard that we use has a certain amount of uncertainty to it, significant amount of uncertainty to it. And obviously one needs to take that into consideration when trying to decide whether a new device is acceptable or not. And I'm not sure what, and I know that is, at least a significant percentage of the uncertainty that we deal with is around the reference device. Can I just make one other comment that hasn't come up in the session? And I'm sorry, I had my chance to talk about this, but I think it's often neglected by us as clinicians. And I think in some of the discussions that we have in here is that oxygen saturation is not a linear measure. So when we look at oxygen saturation, we can measure as a percentage in blood, but in actual fact, what we interpret clinically is disease severity. And if you look at whatever measure you want to use, whether that's, shunt or whatever clinical measure you would have to try and decide how critically ill your patient is, it's not linearly related to the oxygen saturation. So when we come to interpret some of these studies and everything, we've got to be very careful that we should in some way try to make that comparison in a linear fashion. And I can just say we've had lots of experience in doing this when we use pulse oximetry for modeling, clinical outcomes and things like that, is you need to find ways that you can linearize the oxygen saturation measure.
That's a great point. Thank you for that.
And we'll be able to come back to your question on the gold standard and what's acceptable this afternoon in the stats section. I think that's a good question for that. We have Gorm, I see your hands raised if you want to chime in, and then we'll wrap up in a minute.
Yes, yes, thank you. I'm coming back on the question, because I think the key is I'm a clinician. The clinicians overestimate the precision. So I have a simple question. Why is that pulse oximeters never give values above 100? Because certainly sometimes they measure values above 100, because sometimes they're low, sometimes they're high. So that means that hyperoxygenation is underrated because of this sort of, obviously it cannot be more than 100, but clinicians should know. And therefore that would give, because of looking at a trend, that could give simple information that your values tend to be pretty high because they are above 100 most of the time.
Great.
I can give an answer why.
Yeah,
Please, go ahead.
well, yeah, and let's come back to that tomorrow in the session about communication with clinicians and how we can improve on that. I think it's very relevant. There's one last thing before we really conclude for lunch. There's a comment here about this device that was developed by Hewlett Packard in the 70s, 80s. It's come up in a number of articles. It's also been referenced recently in some standards and regulatory groups who are thinking about the notion that why don't we just require all devices to have multiple wavelengths because this worked 30 years ago. I know there are people in this room who have experience with that device and might be able to debunk some of the mythical nature of it, but I was wondering if you make a comment on that or has thoughts on how we approach this issue of, well, why don't we just use multiple wavelengths and then the problem is solved? Because that was what was reported decades ago. Can you make a comment on that?
Yeah.
Please
I could do. So I think the Hewlett Packard or ear oximeter had to have a procedure to basically measure the offset during the earlobe being pressed to being empty of blood, and that made the performance. It's not the wavelengths. So I think the assumption that just adding wavelengths will solve the problem might be not correct.
Thank you, Mike. Do you want to comment on anything related to the HP and the quality of the data, or reasons why it may not have, reasons why it may be overstated or oversimplified to assume that device is panacea for our problems today?
Well, it was the calibration and just the general difficulty of applying it correctly made it such that it just simply wasn't reliable. If it was applied really carefully, it worked about as well as the contemporary Nellcor N100, but it was much harder to use and to apply correctly. And people preferred, people just preferred to put a 2 wavelength device.
Yeah. And then it sounds like, I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on this, but there may be some other reasons why the data that were published on that device were optimized conditions in other ways. But we'll come back to this. We'll break for lunch, but I just wanted to put that out there. Somebody had commented, and that seems to be coming up quite a bit. So we're going to break for 40 minutes for lunch. We'll come back at the hour. For those of you who are online, we'll see you soon. Thanks very much for joining, and thanks to all the speakers in this last panel. Thanks to Quickler for hosting, and we'll be back in 40 minutes.